talk to you.
Okay.
Alicia, I've been thinking about it. And I do realize that my behavior, my inability to discuss the situation with you, must have appeared insane. I left you no other choice. I do understand. And I'm truly sorry.
That's okay.
Everything's gonna be all right. Everything's gonna be all right. Just have to talk quietly. They may be listening. There may be microphones. I'm gonna tell you everything now. It's breaking with protocol, but you need to know. Because you have to help me get out of here. Alicia, I've been doing top secret work for the government. There's a threat that exists of catastrophic proportions. I think the Russians feel my profile is too high. That's why they simply just don't do away with me. They're keeping me here to try to stop me from doing my work. You have to get to Wheeler.
Stop.
You have to find
Stop.
William Parcher. He can help us. He can help us. He can help us.
Stop! I went to Wheeler.
Good, good.
There is no William March.
Of course there is. I've been working for it.
Doing what? Breaking codes? Dropping packages in a secret mailbox for the government to pick up.
How could you know that?
Saul followed you. He thought it was harmless. They've never been opened. It isn't real. There is no conspiracy, John. There is no William Parcher. It's in your mind. You understand? Baby? You're sick. You're sick, John. John! John!
I sent letters to the NSA, which is this organization that is causing anger around the world by listening to the conversations of Merkel, what she thought was private. The game is they don't want it to be understood where their position is in terms of cryptological competence.
Trenton State was known for its aggressive treatments, including insulin coma therapy, which by 1961 had been phased out in all but a few hospitals.
Insulin coma was developed under the mistaken notion that schizophrenia was caused by a metabolic problem, by the way the body regulates glucose. Insulin coma was one of the more popular and unfortunately one of the more notorious treatments in its day.
I don't remember all the details. It's the sort of thing that, like if you go under anesthesia, you remember only the process up to the anesthesia.
A nurse would wake patients early in the morning and give them an injection of insulin. Their blood sugar would drop, and soon they would be comatose. Some patients would suffer spontaneous seizures.
Insulin coma deliberately puts the body into total shock. This was done under supervised circumstances, because if you do that too aggressively, you can die.
I remember some of the surrounding events. There would be a group of people that would be getting it, and then afterwards they would go out on the grounds and pass some time and drink sugar water.
They said, Newman, they are not going to let me out until I'm normal. But that'll never be. I never was.
I began to realize I would not be getting out of the hospital unless I conformed and behaved normally. And so in part I would do that as if I would be sweeping the delusions under a rug, and they were able to come out later on. It could be triggered, and I would move very quickly to accepting it again. Well, I knew where I was. I was there in observation, but I was able to think that I was like a victim of a conspiracy. I didn't feel that I belonged locked up. I never went voluntarily.
Someone who visited him in the hospital asked him, how could you, a mathematician, someone who's committed to rationality, how could you believe that aliens from outer space were communicating with you? Nash's response was, these ideas came to me the same way my mathematical ideas did, so I believe them.
On December 10th, 1994, at the age of 66, John Nash received the Nobel Prize in Stockholm.
Dr. John Nash, your analysis of equilibrium non-cooperative games and all your other contributions to game theory have had a profound effect on the way economic theory has developed in the last 2 decades.
I'm not thinking anything crazy, but there are different possibilities. I don't know what the future holds exactly, even if it's not such a long future. For me. Of course, the future in general is presumably long, unless things really go bad, or unless some miracle happens. In madness, I saw myself as some sort of a messenger having a special function. Like the Muslim concept with Muhammad, the messenger of Allah. These thoughts on the surface are not rational, but there could be a situation where things were not what they might seem. I had the idea that some of the people like Eisenhower and the Pope and the powers that be might be unsympathetic to me. To some extent, sanity is a form of conformity. People are always selling the idea that people who have mental illness are suffering, but it's really not so simple. I think mental illness or madness can be an escape also.
The following summer, he left for Europe alone, once again obsessed with asylum.
So, Professor Nash, has this ever happened to you where you have had some controversial idea which you try to publish?
Well, I have sort of a controversial idea now in relation to money, and I have published something, and we have thinking of another publication. I have been discouraged to some extent about publishing in a certain journal, but essentially the idea is that the governments are producing a sort of system of money that is not really as good as it might be, but people are being taught to think that it is better that the money is just printed in a matter of the convenience, well, which can become a matter of the convenience of the governments, rather than that the money is maintained with any standard value, or the purpose of, like, if there were something like a gold standard, or if it were related just to silver in some definite way. You notice the history of money. There have been metals, so gold and silver go back to the earliest history of any sort of coinage of money.
Right. Thank you, Professor Nash, for your insight.
And later, the Swiss franc, maybe later, I'm not really sure of the time, the Swiss franc became also in a certain relation to gold. So, but then in relation to these relationships, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the British were so stressed that they couldn't maintain this standard value of the pound. Or, well, maybe they could, but they didn't. But after the Napoleonic Wars, for whatever reasons, their thinking was such that they restored the value. The pound became worth the same as it was in relation to the dollar and to gold. Because perhaps the fact that the dollar existed was relevant. So then time passes, and another time of crisis is World War I. At that time, the pound loses value, real value in relation to gold or dollar. Dollar, Swiss franc are fixed in relation to gold in World War I. And that value for the dollar is but this is very arbitrary units. There's something called a troy ounce, which is not the standard American or British ounce, and is also not a metric unit. So after World War I, then the issue is, what can be done? Will the pound really be worth what it was supposed to be worth, or will it not be worth? So a political situation occurs. In 1925, the conservatives are in power, and the pound is restored. The pound restored to its Newtonian value. But there's an element of political influences here. It is natural for the Conservative Party, perhaps in its best function, to conserve something that perhaps should be conserved. But then there are difficulties. In America, first there's the great inflationary rise in the stock market to 1929, and then the crash. Then in 1931, pressure develops on the British in relation to, can this value be maintained? And I think also the thinking of Keynes is influential at that time. To maintain the value of the pound in relation to the gold would mean not to maintain the wages of British wage earners in relation to what they had been getting in terms of pounds. The pound becomes worth more, they would have to be paid less, but prices will be also less. Merchants will have to sell their goods for less domestically. In terms of money, which would really be worth more. So the British faced a problem that it would be painful to maintain the standard value of the pound, which would maintain its respectable tradition. And they could avoid some of this pain. The domestic situation would seem better if people could continue to have high wages, if merchants could continue to sell goods for high prices. But of course, the way the gold standard was supposed to operate, according to the older rules, they were not supposed to borrow money. They were supposed to let gold flow out and let prices fall and let other means of adjustment. Now, I want to pause here to make a meditation sort of historical, even beyond economics. This is 1931. It's an interesting time. If you consider in Germany, 1931 was a lot different from 1935. So what I think is very interesting, of course, almost anything might change the course of history, but that if the pound had been maintained at a standard value, possibly political conditions would be different enough around the world that the NSDAP might not have been able to come to power, might not have got enough votes to get a block in the Reichstag. So if the NSDAP didn't have any significant number of deputies in the Reichstag, I know that they never had a majority actually, but if they had only a few who were like Greens, Hitler would not have come to power. Now, if we go on from this, then in the spring of 1933, we have a new president, a new party, and Roosevelt devalues the dollar. Now, the British and the Americans, they say we're still on the gold standard, but they have not maintained a consistent standard. It's really double talk, but time passes, and there's great talk about Fort Knox, this place in Kentucky where there's gold stored, how solid it is, how wonderful. So one could say retrospectively, that was the end of the gold standard.
Im Rückblick könnte man sagen, das war das Ende des Goldstandards.
And now, what is good? If money is a utility, we need it, we want it, but we need it as a medium of exchange. We need really things of value like houses or automobiles, electricity, water, gas, food, everything, entertainment, and so on and so on. And of course, you have some political situation in Europe, and that there is the proposal for a European currency. And then there are pros and cons. Should it be a strong currency or a weak currency? Who should dominate it? And the British have many worries. They know that they would come in and they'd be just like a province in an empire. So I want to introduce the topic now. And as I said, everyone has a right to his own opinion here. This is a thing where politicians, states will be selling you something. At times of war, you will be asked to buy the state bonds. And they may be called the victory bonds or something like that. But whether it's a good buy depends on the money and so on. So then you're supposed to believe, particularly in times of war or crisis, that your country's money is very good. The cola standard, a cola type standard would be best, but one has to consider that the standard which would be best might not be effectively administered. You see, where do you define the cost of living? In Bangladesh or in Berlin? And you see, it's like an ideal concept, but it's so easily to be politically corrupted. Political decisions might be necessary to determine what is the cost of living. We see this in the United States right now. There are some senators and representatives who want to change the definition of the COLA that controls Social Security. You see, when you speak of monetary policy, it suggests standard economic thinking, but standard economic thinking is based upon the acceptance of existing institutions in their present form and functions. At any given time, there is the class of debtors and a class of creditors, and maybe another class of neither. You can always give a boon, a short-term benefit to the class of debtors by making worthless the unit of measurement by which these debts are measured. You see, I believe that actually when there exists a more respectable type of currency in terms of hardness, is an encouragement of certain forms of investment. An interesting historical thing is that the United States of America for a long time did not have a central bank. The Federal Reserve System was created around 1912 through 1914. It, of course, had to be enacted legislatively and then brought into actual existence. Now this is considered as fundamental as simply like the rocks in the mountains or something. It's something that it should be presumed to exist. So when you consider those, suppose that this Bundesbank, this Federal Reserve, had not been created. There were banks, there was money. What happened was that a bank, a privately existing bank, could issue its own paper money, which is guaranteed only by that bank. But you would be foolish to use it if it were not a good bank.
I wanted to ask what you think of Hayek's suggestion to have competing monies, which might help to have the moral issue. It might help the moral issue because if you have competing money, as you said, you would only use the hard currencies, and the others would simply not be used because people wouldn't trust them. On the other hand, then you would have big problems with the standard. You would have much higher costs of transactions. But what would you think that competing monies are would help this moral question that always arises when it comes to trustworthiness of a currency?
Well, I think it is not so simple with regard to competing money that the hard money would be used and the soft money would not be used. There's a very opposite concept that has been observed in the British context, and it gives rise to what's called Gresham's Law, in which he said that the bad money drives out the good. So it's, of course, it's complicated. And also, you can note that in the last decades or something, if it were so simple that the better money would simply be chosen and used, the dollar would already have been abandoned for international purposes and replaced by yen or mark or Swiss franc. Ideal money and the motivation of savings and thrift. First topic, Keynesianism. It is as if what we call an ideal money, having ultra-stable value, is the natural alternative concept to that sort of money which is to be expected if Keynesian policies or influences are operating to influence and guide the central banks and treasuries. So, for example, a Newtonian money with a given fixed value in terms of a non-political standard, such as gold, lacks the general covariance, that's just a sort of choice of a phrase that relates to general relativity. A Newtonian money lacks the general covariance of a typical fiat money. I feel that Richard Nixon effectively defined the orientation in the technical sense of the values of currencies of Keynesians when he said in 1971, "Now we are all Keynesians." This was after President Nixon had defaulted on any obligation to recognize the credit positions of any other IMF members in terms other than paper dollars, Many economists and economic thinkers have announced themselves as being this or that variety of Keynesian, such as neo-Keynesian, new Keynesian, or post-Keynesian. But all of these seem to me to be essentially the same, at least with regard to the issue of whether or not a currency should be managed so as to have or not to have a stable value. And I feel personally that it helps for understanding to think of the Keynesians as if they are the adherents of a political party or movement. They generally wish to transfer some utility or wealth from the wealthier 5% of a national population to the poorer 25% of the same population. So Keynesianism is effectively a framework through which variously oriented economic experts can seek to promote preferred policies. And to me it seems helpful to compare Keynesianism with fascism of the time of the 20s and 30s of last century. This illustrates the context of fiat money where large interested parties, such as big banks, would naturally be wishing to have favorable special consideration through the government branches. Ideal money and the motivation of savings and thrift. This is my title repeated, but it's the inner part. We present the argument that various interests and groups, notably including Keynesian economists, have sold to the public a quasi-doctrine which teaches, in effect, that less is more, or that, in other words, bad money is better than good money. The saying of Gresham's is mostly of interest here because it illustrates the old or classical concept of bad money. And this can be contrasted with more recent attitudes which have been very much influenced by the Keynesians and by the results of their influence on government policies since the 30s. There are some traditional or popular views associating money with sin or immorality or unethical or unjust behavior. And such views can have the effect that an ideal of good money does not seem to be such a good cause as an ideal of a good public water supply. Here we can wonder about what sort of inflation rates might have been typical for any major varieties of money such as Byzantine money, at the times actually contemporaneous with the Prophet Muhammad? How should society and the state authorities seek to improve economic welfare generally? And what should be done at times of abnormal economic difficulties or depression? We can't go into it all, but we feel that actions which are clearly understandable as designed for the purpose of achieving a social welfare result are best. Clearly understandable. Honesty is the best policy. When I spoke at an economics meeting in Tampa, Florida in 2001 on the topic of ideal money, I suggested the use of an ICPI index for the definition of the proper value for an ideal money. Here, ICPI stood for Industrial Consumption Price Index, which would be a sort of index which could naturally be calculated from world market prices. It's the idea of world market rather than a domestic market. But I did not have any specific proposals like prices for copper or platinum or electric energy to suggest for the index. Now, after some years of thought and observations, I feel that the sort of authority or agency that would be able to establish any version of ideal money, money intrinsically not subject to inflation, would be necessarily comparable to classical sovereigns or seigneurs who have provided practical media for the use in traders' exchanges. We can prepare to appropriately respect the function of such an agency, conceivably like the IMF or the BIS or ECB, and concede to the effective agency some discussion about the specific form of a guiding index of prices. It seems that inflation affecting currencies is generally or normally with some associated unpredictability, although it would be possible, for example, for the Swedish krona to have a 1% targeted inflation rate in terms of comparison with the Swiss franc, although this is not what we would rationally expect because of various political and other considerations.
Professor Nash, I would like to know, what would you like to do the next couple of years? Do you have any goals?
I have research projects I'm working on right now, and I hope to continue with that. And I just discovered, well, I just was reminded of something that I worked on some years back relating to cosmology and general relativity. It's just a small possibility that might have some valuable connections, especially now that the cosmologists are looking for a dark matter or a dark energy. It might be, say, I have a generalized equation for space-time where you definitely do not need a cosmological constant. It was one way of Einstein's way of generalizing his vacuum equation, which he retracted later on because it seemed not to be needed. But he was in principle ready to generalize if it were needed. But I, through various reasons of direction, I arrived at something which looked interesting. It was a fourth order partial differential equation system. It's like the equations of general relativity, except fourth order instead of second order. And there were some nice mathematical properties, connections. So any space-time that satisfied general relativity with a cosmological constant would satisfy the generalized equation, but there would be more things possible. Now, I don't know whether or not a space-time would be suitable for the accelerating expansion effect. The observations that suggest the universe has an accelerating rate of expansion, but it might be. I want to check that out.
Wow, so you mean the universe is described by fourth-degree partial differential equations? Then in that case, it is really much more complicated than it really seems. So I was just wondering, since I recall in the 50s, you went to visit Professor Albert Einstein to talk about some of your ideas in general relativity. So is your current research sort of related to those ideas that you mentioned?
In fact, there is a connection. It's about 60 years ago. At that time, I was thinking about the non-expanding universe, and the idea that the universe might not be expanding, but that the redshift would be introduced by another phenomenon, by a sort of the photons losing energy as they pass through space. But that doesn't seem to be supported by observations directly. It's but some of this work came from that. But it led to different things. This later equation that I have does not represent that the light, that the photons would lose energy. Doesn't represent that. But we do see something very interesting suddenly from Italy. The observation neutrinos may traveling as if traveling faster than the speed of light. Now, in only recent years, the physics theories have developed theories of neutrinos having mass. They found it convenient to have the different types of neutrinos would have mass, because according to their theories that they were familiar with, they liked that the neutrinos needed to have mass for one of them to transform into another. I don't understand and appreciate this as a theoretical concept, but I observed that was what became popular. But this would suggest that the neutrinos would travel slower than the speed of light, and light would travel at the speed of light. So what is observed about neutrinos going faster than the speed of light is the opposite of this. So maybe they're not massive, or maybe you can't be. The massive neutrino theory does not have a mass for neutrinos. They have ideas for the relation of one mass to another, but they cannot suggest a specific mass.
Balance your time now between teaching, between research, and coming up with new ideas?
Well, the thing is, I don't have teaching duties, and that's the standard for the regular faculty at Princeton University. And I'm not on the faculty technically, so I don't necessarily have teaching duty. I sometimes have lectured for a particular class at the university. I was in an occasion like that last spring, and but I also travel around to places and lecture, and maybe on a travel I'm often giving a lecture, and it may be a matter of game theory, or it may be about ideas relating to money. I haven't really an argument with the movie. A life takes actually many years, but a movie lasts like at most 2 or 3 hours. And so how can you depict a life in that length of time? It's not really possible. I think maybe it's very helpful in relation to mental illness. It illustrates a case of mental illness and how there might be a favorable outcome over a period of time from a case of mental illness. And so it encourages some people where they have mental illness, or the families, to maybe hope for some process. And even in that way, the movie is not quite accurate, because it suggests that after many years of mental illness, when recovering, it still depended on some medicine. Whereas in fact, when recovering from insanity and irrationality, I do not depend on medicine.
Do you feel a strong inclination to put the record straight? Do you find it something that bothers you enough to want to, to have an authorized version out, for example?
No, I was not wanting to write an autobiography, and of course, if you write an autobiography at age 60 and then at age 80, you need to add an appendix. So life is not over until it's over.
During that time, or soon afterwards, as your condition deteriorated, you went in and out of treatments and so on. How did Alicia cope as well?
My condition didn't necessarily deteriorate, but it maintained this being a condition. You could say it wasn't worse later than earlier.
Having recovered, looking back on that period of time, how do you analyze it, looking back on it?
I have the feeling that there is not much understanding yet, in spite of what might be said. Of course, they're working. You could see that often one psychiatrist will criticize another.
There was one interesting point, if I may refer to it, during your time with mental disturbances, where you actually went off to Europe. You were looking for asylum in Europe and to renounce your U.S. citizenship. What do you recall of that time?
That was relatively early. Yes, and that was quite early. Yes, well, I developed this idea that I could be a refugee. Well, first I had the idea that I had enemies in the U.S., but I had some political reactions. I had the time that my thinking was partially madness and irrationality, but in some ways I might have an enlightened perception.
And actually there's some belief that being at that level, that enlightened level, is also what helped your theorizing, your game theory ideas and so on, reach a level that perhaps wouldn't have gone that high if your condition hadn't been that way. Would you say that was the case?
Well, I did my game theory work before any mental problems, and I didn't develop any ideas, particularly on game theory, while being mentally irrational. And it's a good area for rational thinking, in fact.
Let me ask you now, as you continue your work, you were one that was very quick to adopt technology. You were using emails in the late 80s when a lot of people hadn't really started utilizing the internet to that degree. Are you one who keeps up with technology in that way? Are you something of a technophile?
I like to think of myself that way, but I think I'm falling behind comparatively in the later years. I may be getting a little slower since I'm past 80 in following up these things. Yes, but I was working with computers. It was sort of my big pastime. That was my cognitive therapy in the early days.
Professor, if you look at personal or private things, something you'd like to achieve in your life, something that there's still outstanding for you, what would it be?
Well, I very much like the idea of doing some good work at an advanced age after many years of not working. So if I could subtract out the years that I did not work, I'm not as old as 81 would seem to indicate. So 81 minus 25 would be 56. So that's not really past retirement age.
What area would you focus on, sir?
Well, I have the areas that I have worked on. To do something entirely different would not be smart.
Professor Nash, how would you like to be remembered? What would you like your legacy to be?
Oh, I really don't like to think in those terms. I like to think more in terms of being alive. It's inevitable that you must die, and then after you die, you're remembered, and that sort of thing. I don't. It's not good to have a bad memory. I think it's sort of like maybe you could ask a good Hindu, how would you like to be remembered? And he would say, well, I should be remembered as someone worthy of a higher grade reincarnation, rather than to be reincarnated as something of a lower character.
You were hoping by having now been at the age of 66 that you would achieve much more professionally. Do you feel that you have had the opportunity and the time to do that, or have your time been mainly taken up by giving lectures or traveling around, being a celebrity?
There has been, much of my time has been taken up in that way, but I have been making progress in the other sense. I haven't completed so much. I have a paper published on ideal money, which I hope to follow up that with another paper extending the ideas. And I really feel I've discovered well, it's hard to describe it, but there has been a deterioration in the quality of money that's observable in many areas, and it brings up questions. Like you could see how money is different all of a sudden in Italy when they had the lira and now they have the euro. So they, in a revolutionary way, have gone from bad money to good money comparatively. But what about the rest of the world?
I found this very fascinating what you're talking about. What are the reasons for this, would you say, that the quality of money has sort of changed?
Well, it's complicated. I think we might get into too much deep waters here.
Okay.
And I don't want to compete with Professor Mundell. And in this meeting, I'm going to be listening to him and learning things when he lectures.
Okay. Oh. But it's a fascinating subject.
Oh, yes. And I have other areas of research, 2 other areas of research I'm about to publish, and my work really relates to game theory. It's a project, and I have other areas of study. I don't know how long I will live and how long I'll be able to, how much I will be able to do, but at least I am active.
Well, if you were to give advice to young students today, what fields should they look into if they are interested in economics?
In economics? Well, with regard to the specific subfields of economics, I don't know so well. I can observe that game theory is applied very much in economics. It would be, I would say, in general, it would be wise to get into the mathematics as much as seems reasonable, and because the economists who use more mathematics are more respected than those who use less. That's the trend. And I don't think exactly like a professional economist. I think about economics and economic ideas, but somewhat like an outsider. Of course, von Neumann was not an economist, but Morgenstern was, and they teamed together on that book. And otherwise, there are a lot of trends in economics. What seems fashionable now, and the general opinion might be quite different after 20 years or so. If someone is starting a career, they should be prepared for changes. I think they should learn things that are good foundations, but don't necessarily depend on a current fashion or what could be considered general opinion or popular opinion. You should maybe try to learn things that would be good for all time, and of unquestionable scientific value. I was thinking about these things when I saw India for the first time in, I think it was last year in January 2003. When driving through the countryside of India, I could see areas where presumably the amount of recognized income, personal income, would be very low. But this gave me the thought, comparatively, one sort of peasant or level Indian and another one might not feel so bad. These are not the beggars on the street, but people out in the country. If they have as much as someone else in that area, if they are not so poor compared to their neighbors. And if you look through history, humans have lived under different conditions. They had to live maybe very, very primitively a few thousand years ago. And so much of this living of the modern humans is very, very recent. And man has existed for much longer than has this technology.
It's fascinating to talk to you, and I'm really, really happy that you have spoken to us today. Is there any concerns? I was talking earlier about young students, and somebody said to me that the teachers are those who open up doors, but are the students who have to walk through them themselves. Did you have any teacher through your period at university which was particularly a role model to you, or how has it been for you?
I certainly had some good teachers who were very helpful to me and influential. And for example, in economics, I only took one economics course, and that was, I was in undergraduate study in Pittsburgh at what is now called Carnegie Mellon. But by coincidence, the person who taught the course that I took it was a course in international economics. And by coincidence, this was someone who came from Austria. So there's actually what's considered Austrian economics is like a different school than typical American or British. So I was, by coincidence, influenced by an Austrian economist, which may have been a very good influence.
Well, thank you so much. I will enjoy very much to be able to listen through when the student discussions are going on as well. Enjoy, Linda, very much. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
And so Nierenberg explained this to Nash, and Nash, how to do this? Okay. That is what I was just explaining to you. And this is the mathematical statement. So if temperature of time and x is a heat distribution in a medium with discontinuous conductivity, you know, any mixture, and the discontinuous initial distribution of temperature, after 1 second, will the temperature be continuous? This is a problem. And Nash is very interested, also checks that he can become famous for this, and starts working on this. Gets started and works on the problem. It's fascinating because we have accounts and testimonies on how he worked on it. Going and meeting the people, you know, getting back to Nierenberg, tell me more about it, I want to know this, and is it true that this and that and that? Nash was not a specialist at all of that, of mathematical physics, diffusion equation, had no idea. And then he went to see other people in Princeton, people in New York. Hey, I heard that you are a specialist of this, can you explain me this, that, and that? And at first his questions were quite stupid, you know, like he was an outsider, not knowing about this, and Nierenberg was starting to wonder, hey, is this guy as smart as they said? And little by little, questions were becoming more and more to the point. And he was putting everybody to contribution as a conductor, you know. Hey, my friend, I need you to prove me this and this. I think that you are the expert and you can give me this. I can use it to prove something more and so on. As a conductor who would give assignments, you know, here you're the violin player, you will play this and this. You are the trumpet, you will play this and this. Each one does their part. Nobody understands the great plan, except when the orchestra starts to play. And Nash had the overall plan for this. And everybody was amazed when after 6 months the problem was solved. Putting all people to contributions. And again, the solution was amazing.
I would never have thought of that. That was my impression of Nash. He had ideas that I would never have thought of. I really thought he was a genius.
A web page existing for quite a while, on the order of 10 or 15 years, that relates to relativity and the relation between the equations of relativity and the actual metric of space-time. And I found an equation which I call the interesting equation. Let's see. This is forward. I found it was a research going very far back. Originally, my idea was that possibly photons are subject to a decay in their energy if they have mass. They have a small amount of mass. And I was thinking in around 1949 AD that that would be an interesting concept, and it would be more favorable to an eternal universe, a longer-lasting universe. And ultimately, I arranged as a graduate student at Princeton to see Einstein. I saw him in presence also of an assistant at his office. Discussion went on for considerable time, and then Einstein said, well, if you have to work really hard over a long time to develop something. Of course, I was a little disappointed, but yet that is very reasonable logically. And he himself was working then on a type of electromagnetic gravitational theory unified, which was not concordant with the existing accepted theory, which was called the Einstein-Maxwell equations, where things just fit together neatly, and you would assume that that is correct because of its neatness and simplicity. Well, then I shift to another topic and mention that the reason I am thinking of thought of presenting this here was that last summer I was at a meeting in New York in the embassy, the French embassy. They had a cultural division which is on Manhattan and different locations from the main embassy. And I was there for a special event, and it so happened that that Louis Nierenberg was also there, and also Cedric Villani was there. There were different events, music, and some discussion of what people were doing. When my turn came, I said something that I had this web page, I had these things that are interesting in relation to relativity, and but that I said these would be noticed for if they were put into an archive publication, that I could publish essentially the same ideas as an archive publication, then it would communicate more than just being on my web page. And that idea that suggested to the idea of using this now, I have nothing else prepared to present as mathematical research. This is mathematical research over a considerable period of time, and so let me look up it there. Yes, well, that is the first page. This web page that goes back to lectures at different times in the past. There was one at Penn State, and there's one also at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, or Dublin University, I forget for sure which. And these can actually be dug up from records on the internet. Well, there's a long trail of thinking that, yes, there was a long trail of thinking that led me to these equations, but it came originally from the idea that the redshift might be somehow a false effect that came due to a loss of energy from light in a large field, and this is somehow related to Yukawa fields. And I started thinking about what could be the partial differential equations of such fields, I went through some calculations, and what came out by surprise, I saw some fourth order expression in these tensor calculus quantities that was scale-free in this character. This is a celebrated property of the Einstein equations. This thing related, so it's scale-free. The structure of a large black hole might be the same, basically, as a small black hole, or other aspects of the scale-free character, which seems nice if you have no basis of scale. But, of course, one can wonder about things like that. This is a movie. I don't have it all under control. But this is just proposed as something that may be of interest if you are a mathematician or a physicist, mathematical physicist, astronomer. So you may be concerned. Recently, for example, there's been a lot of talk about dark energy, and there was dark matter before that. But these concepts, if you look into them, are concepts derived from Einstein relativity, and also from the popular theories of an expanding universe, like an FLMR universe. Friedman, Lemaitre, Robertson, Walker. That's FLRW universe. A popular theory of something that's entirely symmetric as far as two dimensions are concerned, and then there are two spatial dimensions. Well, I didn't get that right. It expands in three spatial dimensions and changes in time. And this is what later on allows what Einstein was concerned with back in 1915, I think, when he introduced a variation, a cosmological term, which was described by a capital letter lambda. And what that did made it possible for a balanced universe in his theory to have what seemed like the qualities of the observational universe at that time, which was 1915. And it seemed that the universe needed some gravitation of matter that could be recognized. But the astronomer looks out into space and in effect, doesn't see any matter. It's like a vacuum asymptotically. You have the matter, recognizable matter in this galaxy, and we see much more of it now. We can find some planets out, but they are like dark matter, since they don't show much, and so one thing this could do, it's like alternative. It can be an alternative, at least for the cosmological constant that Einstein used at that time. It could have been used instead of the cosmological constant, but it would mean using fourth order partial differential equations instead of two. I think there's much more to be learned about dark matter or dark energy. Also, my opinion, my personal opinion, was whether or not something like this fourth order equation could be relevant was influenced by the work done in Geneva with the Large Hadron Collider. You see, the theory of the Higgs boson involves the idea of quantization of gravity. There's just, you said there's some sort of big, heavy particle there, and what does it do? What does it cover? Underlying that, there's standard model theory where quantization of light and more elaborations upon the original quantization of light, electromagnetic energy. And so the idea of some quantization of gravity, well, maybe there can be that. And so then maybe something like this will fit very, very appropriately. So I know the search is not finished yet, but I can write up the archive version, and it has some of the same ideas that I have up to the present time. Now, is it time for me? Oh, you're standing.
Well, first of all, I should say that I think Nash is responsible for bringing me into game theory. We got a problem from Bell Telephone Laboratories, who were developing a ground-to-air missile. And we were given this problem to analyze. And I realized that the problem had to do with game theory. I remembered the conversations with Nash, and I realized that it had to do with game theory. And from the analysis of this problem, I became interested in game theory itself. Nash developed, I think, two fundamental concepts in game theory. One is in the theory of strategic games, is the equilibrium concept, and one is in the theory of cooperative games or coalitional games, is his bargaining solution, and these are two different concepts entirely. And both had a tremendous impact on my work, as they did on all of game theory.
Nash at the time was at the top of his game. His unconventional methods and ideas had made him a symbol of the new spirit in mathematics. In 1955, he became friends with one of his students, Alicia Lardet. Nash married Alicia in February 1957, and by the autumn of 1958, they are expecting a child. Nash continued developing his work on the embedding problem for Riemannian manifolds, published in 1956. This paper contains his famous deep implicit function theorem. After this, he worked on ideas that would appear in his paper Continuities in Solutions of Parabolic and Elliptic Equations, which was published in the American Journal of Mathematics in 1958.
It is famous that the Riemannian embedding was asked him as a kind of joke by one of his colleagues, who was really annoyed at the behavior of Nash, that he found too much arrogant. He's most famous in general for his work in equilibria, game theory. But when you start reading the work that he did, say between 1954 and 1958, in a short period of time on problems of the Riemannian embedding and on the problem of regularity of solutions of partial differential equations, it is just magical. Because these papers are so full of ideas, full of concepts, full of techniques. They are extremely rich. They are somehow a bit messy, especially the first versions of the smooth embedding theorem. It is known as especially messy. But the non-smooth embedding theorem, the first one of the series, is crystal clear, almost crystal clear. And also some of the ideas in the regularity work are beautifully explained. These are really revolutionary works, and when you read the papers even nowadays, you feel something very special about these papers. Nash's work from that period contains to an extreme degree two of the most important characteristics in the art of mathematics. One is the element of surprise. And the technique which Nash used to solve the problem of Riemannian embedding, nobody expected. It gave rise to the convex integration, it gave rise to the Nash-Moser technique. It was really like out of the box. And the other thing is the idea of combining parts coming from various points of view. You know, it's like the conductor explaining the part to each of the instruments in the orchestra. Could you do something? And none of the instruments has any idea of what is the complete orchestration, how it feels. And then everybody plays together and you hear the symphony.
What was the first sign that Nash was in serious trouble? The fact that he didn't come to class. I taught his class a few times. He started to talk in a more dreamy way. He did see significance in numerical events. I don't think I could tell when he was joking or entangled in some terrible fantasy.
And then what was that ship? Titanic. We're competitive in one way or another, yes. My work is always original. I experience myself thinking differently from other people. Then this could be good if I could think of something that wasn't what everyone would think of. I could think of something new, something original. I like to think of myself as a genius, but I later on sort of realized it's meaningless in a sense. You're using a popular word.
Norbert Wiener was one of the first to recognize that Nash's extreme eccentricities were actually symptoms of a medical disorder. After months of bizarre behavior, Alicia had her husband involuntarily hospitalized at a private psychiatric hospital outside of Boston. Upon his release, Nash abruptly resigned from MIT, cashed in his pension, and went to Europe, where he wanted to renounce his U.S. citizenship. Alicia left her newborn son with her mother and followed Nash, who was by then obviously sick and confused. She had Nash deported back to the U.S.
I certainly was quite close to Nash when we were both in school and for a few years thereafter. But I must admit, when he had his breakdown, it became very difficult, and I was very impatient with him. I'm sure other people did much more to help him. The people at Princeton were really marvelous in making a place for him, and he was in very bad shape. Many years when he was just not himself. It was a very hard time. He was committed to mental hospitals against his will a number of times and hated it. And his conversation was pretty incoherent. It was amazing when he eventually came back to being himself, but it was very late. And Alicia was marvelous. I mean, sticking with him through all of this.
The following years, Nash spent in hospitals in Trenton and Boston, partly in dangerous insulin coma treatment. Every time he got out, he spent most of his time hanging around at the Princeton campus. His worsening condition depressed Alicia more and more. In 1962, the Nashes got divorced. In 1970, he stops taking pills. The voices that he hears are still there, but he's policing them now.
You see, the medicine doesn't stimulate. It's not like coffee or something to stimulate the brain. It rather depresses the brain, reduces the quantity of activity. I give a speech, my last speech to mental health people was a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. I had a text that had a sort of economic view of mental illness. The mind, which does some of the work of that, it may go on strike. And the person doesn't think well because the mind is on strike. But perhaps if the labor conditions were changed for that mind, maybe it would cease to be on strike. It would accept the environment.
His wife, Alicia, is always at his side. She has sacrificed her own mathematical career to be with him, and they marry a second time in 2001.
She is just a large part of my fate. We are who we are now, and we have a history.
Princeton is still the hotbed for many great ideas in math. The common room of the golden years of Princeton is now the cafeteria in Fine Hall, where Nash visits several times a week. He eyes the mile-long equations on the blackboard, sometimes discussing them with the young mathematicians. Like Marvin Minsky said, he always has that idea that makes the difference. Sometimes it's just a tiny remark that changes the perspective. In any case, Nash's remarks are always fresh and new.
I have an idea relating to space-time, something that might be relevant, but I don't have a complete theory. I discovered a partial differential equation, or system, that looks interesting in relation to space-time. But if it is good, that means that there's something oversimplified about the equations that Einstein used. But it's an approximate. Things can be approximately correct, and then later on you have to get more complicated.
Yes, I don't think... The most overlooked fact of Nash's life seems to be what a warm and helpful person was hidden underneath his shy and demanding personality.
We flew back together, he and his wife and I. They had changed our flight, and so there was nobody to meet him or to meet me. I managed to contact my daughter, who came and picked me up. We chatted for an hour at the airport. And then when my daughter came, they said, well, they'll take a taxi. And then the horrible tragedy.
May 23, 2015, John and Alicia Nash die in a car accident on their way back from Oslo's Abel Prize. Their taxi crashes into the guardrail of the Jersey Turnpike near Monroe.
We're going back to U.S. on the airplane tomorrow. We might die together. That's fate.
Individuals have a finite capability of adapting to change. In the past, generations would pass before the impact was universally felt in a society. Today, it is upon each person to look after himself or herself and observe the change and try and adapt to this change.
Well, the communications are going differently. If you have to wait for news to come on a steamship from what's happening far, far away, you have to wait longer than if you wait just for a telegraph message.
That's right, or an email, which is even faster.
It's essentially a telegraph.
Yes. Do you have any view on the current status of the economy, of the macroeconomic situation?
I have some ideas. I understand why the subprime mortgage crisis and some of these things came into existence, how there were weaknesses, particularly in the American financial system, made it.
Do you think that the current world global financial system is as weak as it was maybe before 1929, or not that risky?
I don't see that it's really better, and I don't know.
So you are optimistic somewhat out of the outcome.
I suspect, you see, that some of this is the United States of America, while the rest of the world seems really not disturbed.
Affected.
It's just like you're watching a storm that's mostly in a certain area, in another area. So probably the world will mostly go along, and ultimately the situation in the USA will stabilize, partly by the good influence of the rest of the world.
Thank you very much.